okay, I want to help the people around me be as good as they can be. And if I can do that, then that brings out the best in me. That's the best. That's the best me that I can do.
Hello, fellow leaders, and welcome to another episode of the Military Leader Podcast, bringing you conversations with today's most successful leaders. I am Andrew Stedman, so thankful you are tuning in to the podcast and getting a glimpse of some of the amazing conversations I've had with leaders across the military. I hope this podcast is added value for you and your team as you commit to growing as leaders. You're probably listening to this episode on iTunes, but if you're not an iTunes person, you can plug in on Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Google Play Music. And of course, you can stream it online at themilitaryleader.com. While you're there, be sure to check out the articles that my colleagues and I have written about leadership, leader development, team building, productivity, and lots of other relevant topics for growing leaders. You know, the military profession is great for networking. Switching jobs and duty locations creates so many opportunities to meet new peers, mentors, and leaders. But have you ever met someone whose impact is immediately apparent and you wish you would have come across them years ago? Well, that's what I said about this week's guest. In 2016, several peers had told me about Lieutenant Colonel Matt Hardman, but I had never met him. I had also seen some documents floating around from his time commanding 3rd Battalion, 509th Parachute Infantry in Alaska. Then, while I was at the pre-command course, he graciously set up a VTC with our class to share his thoughts on how to win at NTC. At the time, he was Tarantula 07, the Senior Light Task Force Trainer, but then moved on to serve as Bronco 07, the Senior Brigade Trainer. On that VTC, Matt spent over 2 hours pouring lessons into this unknown group of soon-to-be battalion commanders, and after 5 pages of notes that helped guide me through multiple NTC rotations, I can tell you his advice paid off. He didn't have to devote his afternoon to us, but he did it anyway, because he's committed to making the Army more ready. Aside from being a tactics and soccer enthusiast, Lieutenant Colonel Hardman is a candid, authentic leader who can somehow inspire while holding people accountable. He isn't afraid to tell it like it is, and in this conversation, you'll hear his thoughts on the state of Army readiness and what units should be doing to be ready for the next big war, which he says is a sure bet. Because Matt is willing to learn from anyone, it isn't surprising that one of his most important leadership lessons came from a fired-up specialist on a dark drop zone who would not let a correction go unsaid, no matter what rank needed to hear it. Lieutenant Colonel Matt Hardman is currently attending Senior Service College Fellowship and will pin on Colonel sometime soon, surely to command a tactical brigade. I was so thankful that he took the time to chat with me while I was at Fort Irwin last year, and in this episode you may notice that the audio is a little different than the other ones. This is actually the very first episode I did for the podcast, and I've made a few adjustments since then. Regardless, I hope you enjoy this chat with Lieutenant Colonel Matt Hardman. All right, Lieutenant Colonel Matt Hardman. At the National Training Center, you were Tarantula 07, right? And then currently Bronco 07, coaching the brigade staff and the commander. Right? You give some guidance to the commander.
Advice.
Advice?
Not guidance, but advice.
Yeah. Good clarification.
Yeah.
Okay. So first I want to talk about leader energy, right? So you are one of the most energetic leaders that I've ever come across in the Army. Like it's constant every time I engage with you. How important is that energy? In leadership, how important is it for a leader to have that and just display that energy?
So, I very much believe that, it takes all, diversity of leaders is, I think, a key. I mean, good teams have balance of folks, I think back to my company XO when I was a company commander, Dave Pesco, very quiet, measured guy. And I actually gravitate towards folks like that and having folks like that on my team because they offset. And we complement each other. And and I've also worked for commanders or leaders that were very much the opposite of me. In some ways, the folks I've gotten on best with in the Army have been folks that are opposite. Mm-hmm. And it's probably no surprise, my wife and I are somewhat opposites as well. And, I can be too much for people at times. Mm-hmm. And, I had a former commander of mine, you say your greatest strength is often your greatest weakness. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think the other part of that is you got to be who you are. And, it doesn't mean that, if you have weaknesses, you don't try and build on those weaknesses or whatever, but you gotta kind of be who you are and not try to be something that you're not. And, for me, it's just naturally how I am. I'm an incredibly inquisitive person. Mm-hmm. I'm very, curious about the world. I'm curious about people. I can't sit on an airplane next to somebody and not kind of strike up a conversation.
Right.
And it's just how I am. And so, instead of turning away from that, I've tried to just turn into it, just be me. And, it can be overwhelming for folks. And so, internally recognizing when it's not being helpful to an individual or a situation is something that I've had to mature in. And I'm sure folks that know me listen to this will say sometimes I don't get that right.
So from a leader perspective, what does it look like when someone is not lining up with your level of connection, right? Like, what does that indicator look like when you're just too much for?
I just sometimes I sense it, and sometimes, unfortunately, I sense it like when it's too late. Right. But I know, at times, like, people just like, hey, get to the point. Like,
land your plane.
Land your plane. Tell me what you need me to do. But that, by personality type, I tend to, there's no debate I don't want to be a part of. And so, I like to engage people. Sometimes people will take that as being challenged, senior leaders at times, or even subordinates. But, I like to play devil's advocate. I'll throw something out there that I may not necessarily agree with, but just kind of see where somebody else is coming from. Mm-hmm. And, I like to pie problems. So if there's a problem or a situation, I try and kind of pie that problem to understand it better. And, it comes from engaging people. And I think the other part for me personally is that, I really, really like people. I genuinely do. I have a tendency to see the best in folks. And, I think there's a component to our Army and our society is that, Americans love second chances and underdogs. And so I'm attracted to that in people. I'm attracted into, I was a college walk-on. I've always been a scrapper. Yeah. And so, seeing people that overcome hardship or overcome adversity or overcome shortcomings, I kind of revel in their success. And it's a lot of fun to be a part of. And, being an Army officer and in particular in the infantry, you just get exposed to so many people that each one's kind of on their own journey. And I'm just kind of fascinated by people's journeys. And, where I can help, I enjoy helping, folks. And, so for me, that's just naturally kind of how I am. I had a mentor of mine tell me, I think, what he saw as one of my strongest attributes was just a positive outlook. And I think I'm very realistic in the way I view the world. I maybe even a little cynical at times, in terms of how things are, but I'm incredibly optimistic that there's no problem that can't be solved.
Yeah. Right. Which is important in the worst moments in the infantry world. It's good to have a leader that can come up with positivity.
Yeah. And I feed off, I was really blessed as a commander. I had, my command sergeant major was like, way more low key than me, but like the guy always had a smile on his face. And so, that fed me in a lot of ways. That energy fed me in a lot of ways. And, I definitely, I need time to sometimes back up, reflect, think. But I definitely get most of my energy from being around and engaging other people. I got great advice before going into battalion command. Like, a friend of mine, he's like, hey, whenever you're just like beat down and having a crappy day, like, get out of the office, walk down and go see, soldiers, because it'll put a smile on your face. Yeah. And if you can't walk through a company and talk to soldiers and not be motivated, entertained, inspired, you might be in the wrong line of work.
Yeah, right. That's exceptional advice. I'm struck by the authenticity, because it's clear that you're authentic, right? Like, it doesn't sound like you've had moments where you've tried to be somebody else or you try to put on airs. Is that something that came natural for you?
No, I mean, I think, certainly starting out as a lieutenant and, I experienced this at West Point, teaching there where people be like, oh, I'm just not like, I don't think I'm the right fit for the infantry. And you're like, well, why? Well, I'm not 6'5", weigh 250 pounds and, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I always probably had some of those self-doubts and prejudices of how an infantry leader is supposed to act or how a leader is supposed to act. And, I was fortunate. I got 2 platoons. In the first platoon, I was a mech PL and first of the 23rd. And then the second one was, being a support platoon leader. And I think one of the great things about being a junior leader is you kind of get the opportunity to try some things out. And then, reinvent yourself a little bit. And I led my second platoon very differently than I led the first one. Different missions, different jobs. But there were things I look back on as an infantry platoon leader that I regretted, just too much of a loudmouth, too much of rah-rah. And, so the second time around, it's okay, be more me. And I think as I matured, I just got more comfortable just with who I am. Every single NCO I've probably served with has been like, hey, you're too familiar with the soldiers. And it's like, well, I'm familiar with everybody. I'm going to go talk to everybody. I'm just interested in talking to people. And you just gotta be comfortable with who you are. Fully understand, as you mature, you understand the limits and that, potentially you make things awkward for other people if you're not careful on those things. But, really over time. And then, I was very fortunate early on. I had, General Nicholson was my battalion commander, first of the 23rd.
Yeah.
And, I was just always struck by, there's a day in the motor pool right after the transition from mech to striker was announced that Chief of Staff of the Army came down. And I watched as Colonel Nicholson interacted with sergeants, privates, lieutenants, and the Chief of Staff of the Army, and he talked to them all the same way. And
that's admirable.
Yeah, it really. The guy's a master. It's who he is, and he's a very genuine person, and that kind of stuck with me. Of like, hey, you got to do you as well as you can do you.
So that quality, does it take, without discounting the rank? You have to peel the rank back and peel some of the infrastructure of our chain of command and all that back to see the person. Do you find that some leaders just have a hard time disassociating the person from the position and the stature and the rank? Especially here at NTC, as you see leaders come through the box.
Yeah, I've seen folks, throughout my career that I feel like at times, are playing at whatever rank they're in, versus like, hey, just be you. Yeah. I don't do well with like the, oh shucks, I'm just a dumb infantryman, kind of shtick of, and I've heard that from a couple folks along the way, and I'm like, okay, you got a master's degree from Harvard, you're probably not an idiot. And I don't think it's helpful when people do that, because I think it's pretty, over time, it's transparent, certainly with those that are closest. I did get some feedback in a 360 assessment before battalion command from a captain who I really respected a lot. I thought very highly of her, and she's a really good officer, and she was like, I don't think he has any life outside of work. And, as somebody I'd served with for almost a year and a half, and, I was a brigade executive officer at the time. And I was like, damn, like, there's a whole bunch of reasons why I don't want anybody to think that. Like, one, that's not how I see myself. And two, like, I mean, nothing could be worse for captains to look up and see majors or lieutenant colonels and be like, well, I don't want to grow up to be that.
Yeah, that's right. That's my future.
Yeah. And, and so it did cause me to be maybe more open with talking about my family and talking about things outside of work, which those things were a part of my life. I got really good advice going into major time, and I never brought work home with me. I would come in very, very early, work hard, so I wasn't taking away time from my family. I mean, time with my kids was incredibly important to me. And, I got more hobbies than I should. And those are important to me too, because I think they fill you out as a person. But it was eye-opening that somebody thought that there wasn't more there than just, a brigade XO, a major. So I think it's
interesting.
I think it's, as you said, kind of the hierarchy and structure can make it very difficult at times for people that you serve with, for you to be accessible to them emotionally or whatever. And I know it's something I've tried to work on. Of like, we're all human. We all have flaws. Yeah. Like, we all have problems. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges that we've got in our society and in our army is like, people are like, well, everything's kind of going to crap for me, and everybody else has it all figured out. And the reality is none of us have it all figured out. That's nobody does, but we're all doing the best we can. And, and so, everybody's human. I mean, I think, you look at senior leaders and, empathy is probably a trait across our army that we all could do a better job at. I mean, well, those guys just don't get it, man. I guarantee the chief of staff of the army and division commander, they're doing the best they can. And they're, largely, the vast majority of those folks, just like every rifleman in the army, is getting up every day and wants to do the best they can for all the right reasons, So, I mean, I think that empathy, and I've had to remind myself of that, like dealing with senior leaders of like, hey, I just see it different. This person doesn't, they don't hate America.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting you said that about being more personable. I had similar feedback on the True Growth Survey for the pre-command course. The lowest category there was in the rankings was states' purpose for serving, and basically my coach, who was Ray Barrett, he was really great. It really helped me prepare for command. He said, you need to open up a little bit about the why. What's your why? What's your purpose? Because people are curious about that. They want to know. And I think that part of my approach was, well, if I talk about myself in an open, in a forum, it's kind of like, it's not really being humble, right? Like I looked at it like, I don't need to portray the way I'm doing it as the way you should do it. So I wanted to be reserved about that. But people are curious. Like, wouldn't you want to know what inspires the chief of staff of the army? Yeah. Right. Like, so, we're curious about that and we want to know.
Or you just think it's obvious, right? Because your circle that's tightest around you, they know. I mean, they know who you are. They spend all this time with you. But the reality is you increase in responsibilities, like, it isn't necessarily quite as obvious at times to folks. And people bring, I think, preconceived notions of what they think motivates a lieutenant colonel, battalion commander. I think we're all guilty of bringing those kind of prejudging a little bit at times.
There's going to be an incredible divide, it seems, in command, in understanding, and there's a gap. Battalion command, there's a gap. There's an age gap. There's an experience gap to everybody, but just about the field grades. But even the field grades, it's several years. Company commander could be 10 years younger.
Yeah.
And so I've observed over the years that in order to connect that or to bridge that divide, there's really got to be solid communication and repetition over and over and over again. Whether it's in everyday stuff or personal mentorship or vision. That's one of the things I want to ask you was about your vision. So just take yourself back to the morning of the change of command. Your battalion change of command, right? You wake up that morning, you're like, okay, this is the big day. This is a lifelong goal. Like, we're all excited for the day. And then what is in your mind about what you think, what you need to do to get off on the right foot? And what are the things that you really want to do in command to make an impact? Like, what's the core thing you want to achieve during this seminal moment as a leader?
So let me back up. And so a moment at Command General Staff College, would have been 5 years before then. I just left West Point. I'd been a year and a half in grad school, 3 years at West Point, starting CJSC. And I'm looking around with all these guys I'd served with, back together again. And a lot of them have done amazing stuff with special operations units and all these things. And I mean, this clear sense to me that I was like behind. And I'm not talking like just in terms of career, but intellectually in the profession and kind of other things. I was really very much aware that I was behind. And I had to, there were some writing test and it was like, hey, write about success. But the topic didn't matter. You weren't being graded on your ideas. It was really on the structure and grammar and all the stuff, which I was well prepared for, having just taught history at the academy.
Right.
But it was just kind of like this moment of like, holy crap, like, there's a really good chance that I'm not going to do well as a major. And so, how folks define success and all these things. And I kind of I did this kind of thought exercise. Okay, well, what if I'm at 20 years, retiring from the Army, as a lieutenant colonel and never commanded anything? Would I be successful? And, I kind of thought about that for a little bit and wrote about it. And it was like, well, yeah. I mean, because, ambition's important. I always wanted to command a battalion, kind of do all those things. But that's not like how I define success. It's not what mattered. My dad had a heart attack, pretty young. And it was, I think, a big eye opener for him. And, at the end of the day, like, people are what matter. And, I played sports all growing up. Kind of the coaches I had, the people that mattered in my life that made a difference. My friends and their parents, when I was growing up, my parents had a divorce. I mean, folks that really kind of helped me through that time. And like, that's the stuff that mattered, And so as I thought about it, relatively young parent, the way I viewed success, I think was always kind of there, but the first time I'd really like defined it for myself. And, so for me, the day I'm taking command, it was all about, okay, I want to help the people around me, be as good as they can be. And if I can do that, then that brings out the best in me. That's the best, that's the best me that I can be.
Yeah.
And, and so, yeah, I actually did after the command, and I was nervous as hell standing there, went to the theater, got the whole battalion in there, and I hand them out index cards and I like, write your superpower. What's your superpower? Like, everybody in there, and they get done writing, and I collect them all up, and I'm like, well, I want you to know my superpower. I'm like Alfred the Butler from Batman. Like, I don't have any superpowers, but I'm pretty good at helping people like achieve their superpowers. And I had a lot of confidence in that, from my previous time in the Army and then from teaching. And, if I got a superpower, it's being Alfred the Butler and being able to help people And I think it's because I'm genuinely interested in people. Yeah, I'm generally interested in what they do. I have a little bit non-conventional view sometimes of things. And, you know, I think, and so my whole vision was around people, you know, and the other part of that is like long view. Like I think in the Army my wife works for corporate America. I mean, there's this tendency to look quarterly and look short term. And anything worth doing is generally, I think, a long-term like investment, you know. And so a simple example of, you know, you got one of your best soldiers in a battalion and everybody wants to re-enlist that guy. But if that guy's packing the gear to go to medical school and that's his calling in life, what am I doing trying to talk him into staying in the Army? Like I'm far better off like doing everything in my power to help that soldier achieve their goals.
Right. Yeah.
Because one, like it's the right thing to do. I'll feel better about it. He'll feel better about it. And then two, the formation will see that we genuinely care what happens to them.
Right.
Like not, you know, I mean, in a very, you know, Kantian ethics sense that individuals are an end of themselves. And I think if you lead that way and you treat people as an end of themselves, it'll pay back. I mean, it's non-transactional, but people see that and be like, okay, all I've ever wanted to do was soldier, but man, this guy is like motivated me to be as awesome as I can be as a soldier.
Yeah.
And so that, you know, personal leadership, like philosophy. And and I've been fortunate. I've had other people that I've served with that are kind of like that.
There's a little bit of the UCLA John Wooden in there. You know, the best way to raise the collective performance of the team is to focus on the individual's play and get them to the highest level they can. And when each individual tries to achieve excellence in whatever he does, then everyone will be lifted up.
Absolutely. Yeah. And because that goes to culture. And, you know, it's why I gravitated towards going to command an airborne unit. You know, I wanted to be around people that wanted to do hard things. And, you know, the other part going into command, I took command in 2014. You know, I had a very, I'd come out of being a Brigade XO. I'd worked a year helping on this project writing about the Iraq War. And so being in DC, I had a real, I think, just the people I interacted with and the things I got to think about and write about, a real sense that like we were at a moment of transition and shift. And so, you know, my sense was like there were a lot of things I would have loved to have done with the battalion. There were a lot of things that the Army needed me to do. And so that, you know, I accepted early on that I had a responsibility to help the Army and the battalion that the Army had trusted me with to transition, and more importantly, a whole generation of leaders to transition. You know, that although we're still in Iraq and Afghanistan, that is not the focal point for our Army. And there had to be a mindset change occur in a whole host of ways. I mean, not just the way we fight, but the way that we do business, particularly in garrison, that, I believe in my gut that like the generation that you're impacting now and I'm impacting now will fight against an existential threat. And I hope that doesn't happen. But the best thing I can do to ensure it doesn't happen is to prepare leaders, soldiers, our Army to be ready for it. I mean, that's the number one way to do it. And, folks that led battalions in combat, in Afghanistan, Iraq, I mean, that had its own hardships and difficulties, certainly, particularly emotionally. But I mean, I really felt like our generation of battalion commanders have been kind of given like, hey, we got a lot of dirty work to do, and it's not sexy, and it's not all of it's going to be very popular. But the reestablishment of discipline, good order and discipline in our formation. Fundamental skills at how we train, and a rethinking about, the way we're going to have to fight against a near peer competitor. And it is going to take a mindset change. And so, kind of for me, vision and command was pretty easy. I wrote it, and it was easy for me to talk about it because it's what I believed. It wasn't anything that was, outside of that. And I think the other part is that, for kind of each of the main points, I was able to tie an experience I'd had in the Army to it. So for example, I feel, there's two types of people in the Army. There's people that are leaders and there's people that are on their way to becoming leaders. And, one of my favorite stories, is, I came back from Afghanistan. We did a jump. It was a night mass TAC, first jump in 12 months. Probably should have been a night mass TAC as a battalion. And my XO broke his femur on the jump. I got rocked, probably a pretty good mild concussion. And I'm laying on the drop zone at Fort Bragg. And I don't know whether to put my weapon in operation, put my NVGs on my face, get out of my gear, or put my radio together. And I'm trying to do all those things at the same time. So I'm an absolute disaster. And
we've all been there.
Yeah, and this beautiful fire team wedge is coming towards me. And the guy at the apex, the team leader, is like, "Hey, paratrooper, put your weapon in operation, get your nods on your face, and get out of your harness and get moving." And he gets a little bit closer, and it's this kid, Mike Smith. And Mike wasn't a team leader. Mike was just I think he was an AG in the company, specialist, relatively recently promoted. And he's got 3 brand new privates that he's taking charge of and putting in a fire team wedge, and looks beautiful and awesome. And the first paratrooper he came across that was a complete, hot mess, me, he wasn't afraid to step in and start giving purpose, direction, and motivation.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of people that I want to be around, and those are the kind of people I want to lead, and those are the kind of people that I want to follow. And so, culturally, that was the mindset, was trying to get into a formation. I've been blessed. I've been in a couple units where, that became the culture, and it's awesome to be around.
Yeah. That takes constant reminding, right? Because inevitably the normal day-to-day Army life can sometimes get monotonous if you're not training up for something specific, right? And so sometimes, it's incumbent upon leaders to continue to remind them of what could potentially be in our future. How did you do that? How did you contextualize the fact that we could be at war next week or next month?
So, first, as I kind of put myself back into, the pre 9/11 Army, of my mindset and those things. And, so in many ways I could kind of, empathize and it's embarrassing as I think back to things I said, things that other people I heard say, as we were gearing up post 9/11 for Afghanistan and Iraq. And then being in graduate school, after, I did a deployment to Iraq and a deployment to Afghanistan, and, feeling like I was left out, in graduate school, and, I called one of my mentors. I'm like, "Hey, sir, I made a terrible mistake. I shouldn't have come to grad school." And he's like, "Hey, you're just cooling off between bouts. There's plenty of war left. Don't worry about it." And, here we are, we're still in both those places. There's still plenty of, war left. And so, one, being careful what you wish for. Everybody wants to deploy. And so, one of my messages is hey, stop worrying about whether you're going to deploy and start worrying about whether you're going to be ready when you deploy.
Right.
If we end up having to fight in Eastern Europe or on the Korean Peninsula, it's going to be an away game. We're going to be outnumbered, and we're going to be fighting people that know what they're doing. It's not the same thing as fighting rock farmers in Afghanistan, and not that those fights necessarily were easy all the time in all the places we were at, but it's not the same thing as fighting the Russians in Eastern Europe. And, so how do you convince people? Like I guess I don't think I fully ever did. I mean, I think that's an evolution that's still ongoing in our Army. Mm-hmm. I think societally, I think people think that large scale, land war is a relic. Mm-hmm. And, history doesn't predict the future. But that's a pretty arrogant bet, to say that we won't have to fight a war on the scale of Korea or World War II ever again. That's a pretty arrogant bet, based on, human history and human nature. Yeah. And, and again, it's not about being deployed. It's about being ready. Everybody, I had another friend, I love this quote, everybody wants to be a starter. We don't need starters. We need finishers. We need people, that are highly competent at what they do. And there's no there's no magic pill. There's no substitute other than putting in the work and doing the reps. Mm-hmm. And you look at the special mission units, and they're really, really good. And they didn't get an injection. Having gotten to watch them at brag work and downrange work, they put in the work. Mm-hmm. And they do the little stuff right. And, I certainly influenced by playing sports, and, my soccer coach at Davidson, a guy named Matt Spear, and I talked to him right before I went to command, and his advice to me was like, he's like, hey, I really respected him a lot. And his thing was like, hey, he's like, the thing I learned, I stopped worried about recruiting like the best talent. And I started worrying about recruiting people with the right mindset. Cause from mindset, mm-hmm. You'll get capacity, capacity and skill, mm-hmm. not the other way around. Mm-hmm. And I really believe that. And Matt was the kind of guy playing for that we could beat a team 5-0. And at the end of the game, hey, what are the 3 things we're going to improve? Mm-hmm. And that's the mindset. You did well. Okay. And what next? Yeah. And, I think for our Army, I think that we got to stoke that inner drive to just constantly be better. Yeah.
That's what professionals do. Yeah. They don't need to be told to go out and hit the sled or similarly grab your rifle and go do dry fire, and do another set of PT, or whatever it takes.
And, we're blessed if our number never gets called. You've seen combat. I've seen combat. I've seen a lot of good people die and a lot of bad stuff. And I will count myself blessed if I never have to go to war again. Mm-hmm. But if I go, I want to be as ready as I can be and everybody with me as prepared as possible. Yeah. I mean, and they try to communicate this to young leaders, like, the test is, can you look in the mirror? You go to combat, and can you look in the mirror? Can you look at yourself and say, I did everything I could possibly do? Given the amount of time available, the amount of resources available, I did everything that I could possibly do. Mm-hmm. And if you can answer that, then you'll sleep at night, mm-hmm. And I lost soldiers in Iraq, and I was training when I got notified I was going to Iraq, and the rest of my battalion wasn't. So I sleep at night. I laid it all out. I did everything. I didn't do everything right. Mm-hmm. There's stuff I would go back and do differently. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't for a lack of commitment and effort. Yeah. And, we're human. We're going to all make mistakes, but you don't want to look back and be like, I kind of sandbagged it. And that's, and incidentally, when I came out of command, no regret, no people warn me, oh, you're going to be sad. And mm-hmm. I wasn't. Yeah. I left it all out there.
When you give it your all, there's
that's exactly it. And I got a high five with a great guy that took over from me, and I know for a fact is doing the exact same thing. Yeah. And I mean, I think, at least for me in terms of happiness, like that's it. Like no regrets. Mm-hmm. The Army, however this ends for me, I'll be fine.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes recently was by Archilochus in 640 BC, way back then. He said,
a recent quote.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Recent quote that I discovered. We don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah. My battalion commander, Dan Morgan, when I was in 187, I mean, he used to use that one, and it's true. And it's absolutely true. And I think people, I guess what scares me right now is that people underestimate like what could be in front of us. And, and so I was at this conference last week and, Marine 06, very eloquent kind of talk. And, our propensity as a military to lose the first fight. And, we've recovered from that in the past. I'm not sure we'll get the opportunity the next time around. And, the surest way to have a short war, and a less bloody war is if we end up in conflict, whoever our adversary is, to absolutely knock their clock and, don't let them up off the mat. And if we can do that, we're far more likely to have less war.
Right.
And then we're far more likely to be able to be in a position of, extending a hand of peace. But our adversaries took us to school over the last 15 years. And right now, I think they can get in the ring with us. And, we have to get our dominance back. So that's not the case. Yeah. I think that's lost on a lot of junior leaders. I mean, I just think they assume that, well, we're Americans. Of course we'll win.
Yeah. No.
It's not a given.
No. Yeah. I just read This Kind of War, in the first 10, 15 chapters of that is the Americans fighting for survival. And we don't often have to fight for survival on a strategic level, and so that was pretty humbling or pretty sobering to see. But so you think the decisive point is kind of shifting toward the fronter end, the earlier end of conflicts?
I think that gives us the best, one, it's the number one deterrent. I mean, that gives us real deterrence. I think the second part is, I don't know how conflicts, particularly on the peninsula or Eastern Europe or other places in the world, could play out. But given, at least recently kind of this, gray area, I mean, take, for example, Eastern Europe. I mean, if we're tried with, kind of little green men and hybrid militia and they come at us to see what we're all about and we absolutely clean their clock, well, it's far more likely that we're going to end up in general war, in my opinion, and, from what I studied of Iraq and, I think there were missed opportunities early on, based off our, mistakes that we made at echelon. And as professional soldiers, I mean, that's all we can do. We can only be as ready as we can possibly be. And I think another part of that is, and I think it's a product in some ways of our society, maybe some pathologies out of the war. But this idea that it's somebody else's job. It's somebody else's responsibility. We don't have enough of this or that or whatever. And that all may be, well and good, and it may be true. But we only control what we can control. And, so it's like a company commander or a battalion commander, anybody complaining that somebody hadn't given us this or haven't done this for us. Okay. Unless you're maxed everything you got, then you got to put your head down and get after it. And it doesn't mean that you don't communicate, shortcomings or risks, all those things. But it's mildly interesting. Our battalion, our brigade went to JRTC at 70% manning. We've been slated to downsize, and it was just the way it shook out. And it was like, I talked that one time with my OC and then turned to the formation, was like, okay, no more. Nobody cares. The enemy doesn't care. The enemy doesn't care that, they don't care. And we got to break that, like, that we're expecting somebody else to solve it for us. They're not. They're not going to solve it for us. Or that should be the hypothesis.
Right. Yeah. So let me ask you about NTC then.
Yeah.
In the training mindset. Do you see that units come here and go through a transformation, maybe a mental or a psychological transformation in the way they see the future fight? Do they get here and get tested to the point where their eyes are open a little bit more about what they could face?
I think so. I mean, I think, some leaders have talked about, once a unit's come through 2 or 3 times, there'll be a change. I don't think personally don't think it's really the unit, because the unit, there's so much turnover and the way our personnel system works. A unit that came here 6 months ago will have significant turnover. There'll be pockets that have kind of experienced it and seen it. But I think more importantly, generationally, like our Army, I'm very, very confident that when the folks that are coming through here as company commanders come back as field grades, we're going to see pretty dramatic change in the capability of our Army.
You mean the ones who've gone through the decisive action rotation as, say, company commander? Company commander.
Yeah. And then they do awesome things, high five, go to CJC, and then they're back here as a battalion S3. And I think that's where we'll see a pretty significant change. Okay. That's my personal opinion. It's eye-opening. Every leader I've talked to has been, I think, surprised by the tempo here, and in some, it's funny because you talk to battalion and brigade commanders, and many of them had come through here when we were still doing decisive action pre 9/11 or even or before 2003, and so it's there and it's in the back of the recesses of their mind, and then it's like, oh yeah. This hurts.
I've only got 6 hours for MDP,
Yeah. And it's just such a change from the mission readiness exercises. But we owe it. We owe to stress leaders to their absolute most, and we owe it to try and break their systems and processes here. We owe that. 'Cause, I think that we can throw, as hard or harder than what folks are going to get in combat. I hope that's what we're doing here. And it's all out of love. It really is. That sounds like, but it is out of love. There is every unit that I've covered down on that's come through here, I follow them and I'm looking for them on Army Times and all these other things. I stay in touch, and I know General Broadwater and Colonel Laurie, the COG, are the same. We just want the best. We really do. We want units to be as well as they can possibly be. And because of what we see and immerse kind of in this, I think there's, we're hoping we're doing it fast enough to make units in our Army better.
Yeah. Colonel Kaufman, the COG, as you know, before Colonel Laurie, he said to dive into your weaknesses, to go and expose them, to root them out and spend time on them so that you can understand them. Because, if you came here and had a great rotation, everything was wonderful, you won every battle and all that, there would still be weaknesses that weren't exposed that you could become more lethal if you unpack those and dove in. He was like, just embrace it. If you don't know the defense very well, spend a week studying the defense and then go do a CPX on it and then go out in the field and focus on it.
I think that's spot on. And I think the other is aim for mastery. Aim for mastery. Master fundamental skills and they will apply to other things. I kind of went full circle, the counter IED fight. My last deployment in 13, it's like, hey, there's no magic button. Let's just do combined arms maneuver. Link intel collection with fires, with, ground maneuver, with air maneuver, and weird. The IED threat, you'll handle that threat. It's an obstacle. And so, I think we got to resist that there's some gimmick or trick to any of this. It's hitting the sled and doing the fundamentals really, really well. And if you take a unit that doesn't get the chance, maybe based on time, to train the defense as well as they like, if they've done the fundamentals, they've done all the right things in attack, they've mastered how to do an attack, military decision-making process, the operations process, troop leadership procedures, PCCs, PCIs, rehearsals. If all those things are at A level, that will translate into doing a defense pretty well, in my opinion. It will translate into doing those things pretty well. Are there going to be gaps? Certainly. But if you're just kind of going through it and hoping that it'll work out, it won't.
You sometimes feel
gaps
like
are there.
You sometimes feel like we lean on mission command at the expense of mastery.
Well, so mission command, here's a great, so mission command is not for staffs. I mean, staffs do like detailed planning, right? And they're into science and, but you take a unit that's done, deliberate attack and training 10 times. And they've done it well, mastery. Well, then as a battalion commander, when you issue your intent to company commanders and they have something to fall back on, we fall back to our training, they will be able to perform with intent. They will be able to, okay, hey, take the last overlay that we had, use that. We're just going to do, deliberate attack like that. But mission command isn't like without control. I think you do detailed planning, give detailed graphic, direct fire control measures to subordinate unit. What mission command really is now as a commander, your company commanders can solve these problems. They can be like, hey, stop at this phase line, to an adjacent unit. Okay. Hey, I'm pulling up. Hey, the enemy, they're actually east of this phase line. Hold on a minute. I'm going to pull up to this phase line. I'm going to establish support by fire. And now we're able to crosstalk. We're able to solve that problem because we've, the higher headquarters has created a framework in which they can solve that problem. Sure. They can adjust to reality on the ground. I mean, mission command is not, hey, go out there and self-actualize. Right. And like, that's what a lot of people think it is. Yeah. And it's intellectually shallow. And oftentimes it glosses over because we're insecure and not competent in our, what we're doing. And there's time to do this stuff. There's time to do detailed direct fire control measures. If we get a lot of reps at it, we can do it really fast. It's like the first time you JMPI'd a jumper. It took you 30 minutes and you didn't even get to the pack tray. Right? But with enough reps, you're able to do it intuitively without thinking. And so there's a lot of skills that we've got to be intuitive at without thinking. And that's only going to come from repetition. And then once we do that, now we're able to like, hey, that's not going to work. Stop. Hold where you're at. I'm moving forward. We're going to do this.
In The Speed of Trust, Stephen Covey talks about trust is character and competence, and we forget that you've got to prove competence. Even if you've been in the seat for a while, you've got to prove it in different areas. And when the team changes and reforms and under different conditions, you got to prove that competence again. You can't just run off and...
I mean, my experience was I had company commanders that based off a lot of reps, a lot of time, like I could unleash. And they would tell me when what I told them to do didn't work. Hey, sir, that's not going to work. I need to do it this way. Roger that. We're good. Now I understand. Right? And then there were other people that I had to mission control. I mean, they lacked the competence. A lack of competence, insecurity there will lead people to be less trustworthy. And I don't mean that necessarily lying, but, the other shade of lying is, it's bullshit. It's trying to get through the moment so we don't get revealed out for that we don't know. Right. And we have a bullshit problem in our Army. That people just want to get through it. And they don't want to, master it. Right. So
let me shift gears then. So so your professional development approach, your routine, how's it now and how's it morphed over the course of your career?
So I had really good role models. I mean, I go back to General Nicholson and what he did when I was lieutenant. And a big part of me was I want to give that back to other people. I got this. I had great battalion XO, I was fortunate I had Pat Work as a fellow. He was a company commander when I was a company XO.
Yeah.
And, and there were people I looked up to and that invested their time in folks. And so, formatively as a senior first lieutenant, I was like, ding, ding, ding. This is it. This is right. This is what it's supposed to be. And probably one of the happiest years I've had in the Army. I wouldn't have probably stayed in the Army without those leaders at that time. And, so that had a big impact on me. Teaching at the academy had a big impact on me, and understanding that people process information differently, that people learn differently at different paces. And the other, I think part of that, so my deep, PowerPoint's overrated. I mean, that what I learned from teaching at the academy is you get the question right, and you don't have to lecture. People, they will, the student will be the teacher, and I think the other is it's influence of games, and I don't use it in the kind of the trivial sense, but playing soccer. I mean, the best way to learn how to play soccer is playing soccer. Now it's best done small-sided, right? And we thrive on competition. I mean, human nature, we're wired that way. And so, I looked at leader development of, okay, how do I give people repetitions? And so as a battalion commander, I use tactical decision games pretty extensively. But even doing a platoon live fire, okay, you're going to brief it. We're going to talk about it. You're going to do a virtual exercise. You're going to do dry and blank. You're going to do live. And then you're going to go do a sticks after. Because in the situational training, I can do things to you I can't do in a live fire.
Yeah, right.
I can sleep deprive you. I can take away chow. I can make you walk 20 kilometers. I can double the number of enemy on the objective and make you deal with that adversity and all those things. But for me, the science is live firing. Kind of mastery or proficiency is live firing. That's where you demonstrate that you're safe, that you're capable, that you understand the capabilities, limitations of your formation and weapon systems and platforms. And then force on force is the art. But you can only get to art, I think, once you've mastered science. Yeah. I think the other is, one of my areas I've identified, I think there's a lot of improvement. I think most of our professional military education, much of our training, it gravitates towards the bottom third, the lowest common denominator. We set low expectations and then we're shocked when people meet them. Right? I got 9-year-olds and I'm always amazed that they know more, they're more capable than reflexively I often give them credit for. And I think the same thing is true with soldiers. And I think it's, if we ask more, we'll get more. And they'll feel better about it themselves. I mean, because we all feel better when we accomplish hard things and do hard things. But then we got to be willing that it's some people are going to be a little bit slower, and that's okay. I mean, as long as people are given 100%, as long as they're all in, that's okay. We work more with those people. And so, the way I did it was we did an assessment right out of the gate. So as soon as folks would sign into the unit, sergeant through staff, sergeant first class, and lieutenants, pre-command captains, pre-career course captains, we do a leaderboard. And so did an interview with a chaplain, and then we give them a PT test administered by the company commander or HAC first sergeant, and then they would do a tactical decision game or exercise, an ethical decision exercise, and then a board by a company commander, first sergeant, platoon sergeant. And they would just get asked a lot of really hard questions. And they'd get kind of put on the spot. And so part of it was to assess, hey, where's this person at? In terms of doctrinally, technical proficiency, tactical proficiency. Some of it was about, okay, let me look under the hood and kind of see how this person's wired as a leader. But the other part was to lay down kind of the marker of hey, we have incredibly high expectations. And if you're not if you're not there right now, then you have work to do. And you need to put in work. Was
the ethical dilemma, was it something detailed or was it a simple?
It was pretty pretty detailed. It was based off of 15.6 I did.
Oh, gosh. Okay. All right. We won't unpack that one then.
Yeah. It was pretty detailed. But it was just one of those, like, most problems don't, if there was an easy answer, somebody would have figured it out. And usually it's least bad choices. And, and I think the other is, one of the other things, like, ethically is like, and nobody said doing the right thing was going to be consequence free. Uh-huh. And I was very blessed. My undergraduate education, Davidson College, the honor code there, and having watched my dad, in business and kind of all these other things. I love the Mark Twain quote, always do right. You'll please some, anger others, and astonish the rest. And it's like, just do right. And it won't necessarily be consequence free. Doing the right thing is, somebody will not agree with you, but again, it goes back to, can you look yourself in the mirror in the morning? And I think there is a degree of, like, with that, where you can help people is, thinking in terms of, like, some impulse control, like, hey, oftentimes there's times to stop and think about what you're getting ready to say or do. I've certainly learned that. Right. Hey, there's usually somebody that you can go, like, hey, this didn't feel right. I'm not sure if it's wrong, but you can go talk to somebody, we put a chaplain in a battalion. So, a lieutenant sees something that he doesn't think is right. He may not have the confidence to act yet. He may not know if it's wrong or right. He's too new and inexperienced, but it unsettles him or her. Well, if it unsettles you, like, you should probably go talk to somebody about it. Yeah. And I think it's incumbent upon leaders to create an environment where people can do that. Where it's like, they can come in your office and be like, hey, sir, okay, man, like, you thought this is, like, wildly off, and it's not, and here's why, and unpack it with them. Or, yeah, man, you're right. That's, like, probably not the way we ought to be doing business. Yeah. And probably doesn't mean we need to, like, court-martial anybody, but it probably means that we need to sit somebody down and have a talk with them and help them get better.
So I think that's one of the really magical things about our profession is that we have a common unifying drive. We're all serving for the same purpose, ultimately. And so that when we see a problem, or we see something that's out of line, you don't have to be afraid of what stepping forward to solve the problem is going to do for you in light of, like, your peers, left and right. Like, when you solve that problem, it's going to make us all either safer, more lethal, more effective, or a tighter team. Yeah. So I'll come out with it, but civilian businesses, areas of government, they don't have that. It's a rat race among individuals. And so when you step out, you say, hey, I want to, I'm not too sure about this. Like, you can put yourself at risk.
So, but we're a hierarchical organization, and, like, the right thing will not always be rewarded. And I want I want leaders in general to, like, know that. It doesn't, but because we're a profession, we're not a business, it's still your duty to do it. Yeah. To speak up and say, hey, this isn't right. And I've had those instances where I've said that, and it hadn't turned out great for me at times. And it's like, okay, like, I'm okay. Like, I sleep fine at night, and we would love to believe this works the way, things do in movies, but it doesn't. It does not work that way. There are things that you got to take the long view on how you solve those problems, but at the end of the day, you just got to gravitate towards doing what's right. Yeah, and it's just let the chips fall where they may. And it's like, you got kids, I got kids. My kids don't give a crap what rank I'm wearing when I leave the Army or what, positions I've held. They don't care. Yeah. They won't care. My mom doesn't care. Yeah. But she cares that I do the right thing. And, and I think it's discouraging when people see folks not do the right thing. It when leaders don't do it, others see it, and it's makes it that much harder for others. But I've always felt exhilarated when it's like, hey, I've seen something that just isn't right, and most of the time it's worked out, but there's times it hasn't worked out.
Yeah, sure. Well, good. Well, let me ask you one more question, and as we wrap up here, this is really cool. Thanks for taking the time to do it. If you can insert one leadership lesson to every leader into the Army right now, one lesson that we all really need to learn, what would it be?
Culture matters, and culture in organizations matter, and arguably more so the bigger the organization gets. I did this out in the desert a couple months ago. I kind of looked at every unit, every organization I'd served in, and I kind of graded it, and not necessarily, just being in a battalion, it'll go through periods and phases where it's like, okay, for 9 months it was one kind of organization, and for 14 months it's different. And, for me at least, it was pretty clear to tell the differences of when, and the things that the best units or best organizations in snapshots in time had were culture, and a culture of accountability, a culture of excellence. I mean, commitment to being as awesome as individuals as we can be, and as a team as we can be. And it's powerful when you're a part of that. That accountability, I mean, it's holding oneself and others accountable, and without, malice or without but just like, no, man, this isn't how we do things. We're going to do it right. And, it's a way more fun to be a part of an organization that's like that. That the team matters, that culture of serving in a brigade where every battalion's in it for themselves is not a lot of fun. Serving in a brigade where it's like, hey, we're all in for the brigade, and the brigade's all in for the division. That's powerful. And, I see it out here, 14 rotations and 20 years in the Army. I think get culture right. And, it's not the barbecue and the org day. That's not it. It's all about the little things. It's all the little habits make all the difference in the world. Do people turn things in on time? And when they're turned in, are they at a high standard? What happens when things go wrong? Do we look left and look right and be like, well, you did this? No, I didn't. Or is it like, hey, we screwed this up and we're going to figure out how to solve it? And, I think it takes special leaders to build that kind of culture. But I think it takes like a team mindset, above all else, of like, I just, I think I think there's this mythology out there that somebody's got to lose for somebody to win. And it's not true. I mean, I was in a brigade where every single battalion commander made colonel, went on to go command something, went to senior service college, and it happened because it was a team sport. And, there's a lot of truth in that. And then at the end of the day, none of that stuff is why we're doing it. So it's about the mission, and it's about the men, and get after it. And I think that, that culture, I mean, it's special, and you see it. You get around organizations and you can tell it's there, or you can tell when it's absent. So that's, for me, that's the number one determinant of, one, whether or not an organization is going to be like peak performance, and also like whether it's an organization that people want to be a part of. So I guess I'd leave you with. Yeah,
that's awesome. Cool. Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. And this is good. Tons of good lessons here, man. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thanks for your time, Drew.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Matt Hardman. Matt is a good buddy of mine. I've learned a lot from him over the last couple of years, and I appreciate him taking the time to come on the podcast and share his thoughts and insights. One thing you might have noticed that I certainly picked up on in my conversation with Matt and with some of the others who have been on the podcast, like General Kaufman, Colonel Lopez, General Brown, there's a difference in the way they talk about leadership. You can tell that they come at it from a perspective of building the team. They bring their people around them, and they get on the same team in the same huddle with their people. And, that's a perspective of leadership that is, it's inclusive, it's encouraging, and it can be in contrast with some of the other leaders that some of us have worked for in the past, and you may have seen in the past that draw a line between themselves and their people. It's almost like they point at them and say, "You people better do this job. I demand this from you." And there's a dividing line. There's a nuance in that perspective I think is important, because I think everybody agree that we much rather work for someone who brings us onto the team and encourages us, throws a hand around, on our shoulders and tells us we can do it, versus the person who stands back from afar and says, "Get it done," in a way that's not inclusive. So, that really comes out in Matt's leadership approach and several others, and just encourage you to be that leader who builds the team and versus one that's divisive. Next time on the Military Leader Podcast, you'll hear my conversation with author, speaker, and retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. You may recognize Lieutenant Colonel Grossman from his most notable book, On Killing: The Psychological Cost of Killing in War and Society. This seminal work explores the killing experience and describes how the military over the generations has crafted its training to be more effective in combat and inoculate service members from the impacts of killing. He followed On Killing with On Combat, which describes the physiology of conflict and details the stress reactions a person experiences during a violent event like combat. I asked him to describe those effects in this interview, and then also talk about how the influence of leaders can reduce the stress that soldiers experience in combat. Lieutenant Colonel Grossman offers a ton of insight in this interview, and here's a clip of what you'll hear next time.
What we've got today is we've got that open order more than ever. The shots fired, you go to ground, and suddenly you're alone. You can't see anything. You can't see your friends. You can't hear your friends. And there's great value in that leader that just goes from position to position, puts a hand on the shoulder, tells them good word. Hey, second squad is maneuvering left right now, give them some cover fire. The presence of the leader is one of the most powerful tools in enabling performance in combat, living with whatever you have to do in combat. My leader was there. My leader supported and encouraged me to do what I did. My leader approves of what I did. Leadership is that critical glue that holds the unit together. He can't see the guy to his left or his right, maybe, but he can see that leader that comes by and puts a hand on his shoulder and talks to him and guides him. The stack's going in the door, and the leader's standing there tapping everyone on the shoulder as he goes in the door. We're putting the stack in the door, and the leader's there, smacking everyone on the shoulder or tapping him on the helmet as he goes in. That's leadership, to be there for them, they're our greatest need. The team leader leads from the front, but from that point on, in most senses, our squad leader, our platoon leaders, they are the ones that are kind of the glue that holds it together by moving across that line and communicating across that line and holding that unit cohesion together.
Look for that episode next time on the Military Leader Podcast. Right now, why don't you head over to themilitaryleader.com and get on the Military Leader email list. That way you'll know when a new blog post or podcast episode comes out. That's the best way to find out. Remember, the views expressed here do not represent the Department of Defense or the U.S. government in any way. Thanks for listening, and lead well.